Hello and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming, and today we have another entry in our bolt action unit guide. And today we are going to be working our way up the high explosive weapon profiles and taking a look at the light howitzer. And much like a lot of the other support weapons in bolt action, this is going to be a weapon that can appear both as an artillery piece and also on vehicles. And it is going to possess a lot of the stats that we're used to seeing on these light ordnance weapons. But first, I would like to introduce this weapon as one that is prevalent across the board, regardless of what faction you're going to be playing. Artillery has been a staple of warfare almost since its beginning, and a good number of the howitzers that were present during the outbreak of World War II had been around since the turn of the century, which means these high explosive weapon profiles are very accessible across the board. And without getting too far ahead of ourselves, I think they are weapon profiles that are very much worth having in your collection. But let's go ahead and peer into the stats behind this light howitzer, and right up front we are going to see that it is a 3-man teamed weapon, coming in at 50 points if you run it as a regular. And that is very much on par with the other weapons we've seen, like the light anti-tank gun and light autocannon. And much like those other pieces of ordnance, the light howitzer is usually going to have a gun shield in its standard profile, though sometimes you will see this weapon coming in at 45 points with a 5-point optional upgrade to add the gun shield. And personally, I do think that is an upgrade that is very much worth paying for. Again, gun shields are going to increase your resilience from incoming small arms fire, and sometimes that alone can be enough to deter your opponent from firing something like an extra hull MMG into the squad. 3 men, after all, will die rather quickly, and if you are down to 1 man, you're going to lose your ability to reposition and also suffer a -1 hit when firing, so anything you can do to avoid that and outright death is very much recommendable. After that, this is going to have the fixed keyword, much like most other artillery pieces, which means on an advance order, you can pivot this weapon and suffer a -1 hit penalty should you want to adjust your arc of fire. And because this is a light artillery piece, if you take a run order, you will be able to make a standard 6-inch move and relocate this weapon, something I did fail to mention in my previous video on the light autocannon. But yes, all light and medium artillery pieces can make a standard 6-inch movement on a run order, so long as they are not down to 1 man. But after that, we are also going to see that the howitzer weapons are going to have the howitzer special rule, meaning that they can fire both directly and indirectly, which is going to give it 2 separate range profiles depending on which way you are shooting it. Now, shooting directly is going to go off the standard hit modifiers when it comes to targeting your enemy, while firing indirectly is going to allow you to hone in on your opponents the way you would with a mortar. And since we haven't covered mortars yet, I am going to go ahead and explain the indirect fire real quickly. Basically, you target an enemy unit beyond your minimum range and within your maximum range, and then roll a d6. On a roll of 6, you have successfully guessed their coordinates and scored a direct hit. However, if you fail to hit on this roll, you are now zeroing in on your enemy based on where your last shell landed. And the next turn, if you are firing at the same target and they have not relocated, your roll to hit is going to go up by 1 up to a 5+, and continue to go up each time you fail to hit as you zero in your shells, which sometimes can take quite a while. However, once you do score a successful hit, you are quote-unquote zeroed in on that target, and as long as they don't move, you will continue to hit them on a roll of 2+. And believe me when I say that I have selected targets with indirect fire and immediately rolled a 6, meaning I get a hit right off the bat, and then they are also zeroed in for me to shell next turn. And if your opponent's unit has too many pins on them to reliably activate and move to shake that zeroed in artillery, it will likely become a snowball effect where your opponent's unit is simply locked in to getting shelled continuously until they are destroyed or run off the table. However, note that just because a unit can do indirect fire does not mean it can shoot at targets that it can't see. Some artillery pieces are going to have the option to add a spotter for 10 points, which will allow the unit to fire not only with its own line of sight, but also from the line of sight of the spotter. And the main advantage of doing this is being able to hide your artillery unit far away from your enemy's line of sight, meaning your artillery piece is not only going to be hidden from enemy units that may be approaching on it, but also enemy artillery pieces who may be doing counter battery and trying to take out your artillery pieces. So taking a spotter may be a worthwhile investment in keeping this unit alive, especially if you plan on doing only indirect fire. However, it may not always be the best thing to do. Sometimes doing direct fire is more reliably going to score hits than waiting to zero in on a target, and indirect fire does require some time and luck for it to pay off successfully. Meanwhile, a howitzer using direct fire can simply just shell enemy units, sometimes only suffering -1 to hit for long range. Also, just because you don't have a spotter doesn't mean you can't indirect fire. you just need to indirect fire at things you can see. So if something happens like, say, a friendly vehicle moving in front of you and blocking your direct line of fire, you can simply, provided you still see your enemy target, just use indirect fire in that scenario. Or if your enemy is, say, hiding in ruins and keeps taking down orders, making you hit on double sixes, then you can simply choose to stop firing at them directly and then start honing in on them with indirect fire, which will either A, force them out of cover in due time, or B, zero in on them until you start getting hits. So in that regard, howitzers are a very flexible unit who excel at getting enemy infantry out of hard cover. And while you could potentially use a light howitzer the same way you would use a medium mortar and hide it behind cover while your spotter draws line of sight, I personally prefer my howitzers to be able to draw line of sight to my opponent. That way, if I do lose my spotter, they're not going to be a dud unit for the rest of the match, or spend the next few turns relocating. Because, as I said earlier, sometimes your chances to hit with direct fire are going to be a lot better than waiting for that indirect fire to zero in. But lastly, light howitzers are simply not that expensive of a unit. There really isn't that much of an extreme need to hide them, and if you do lose them in combat, as long as they've gotten one good hit in prior, there's a good chance they've already made their points back. Also, if you are using direct line of fire, the closer your enemies get, the easier it is going to be to hit them, though you still are going to need to watch out for things like snipers and enemy counter batteries. So I perhaps would deploy cautiously or later on in the deployment phase, and perhaps angle your firing arcs so that way not everyone who comes down the street, so to speak, can see you. But now that we've fully covered the difference between direct fire and indirect fire and how I would recommend using them on the light howitzer, let's go ahead and finally take a look at the weapon profile itself. And here we are going to have another 48-inch weapon, much like the other light artillery pieces. However, in the brackets, we are going to see its indirect fire range, with a minimum range of 24 inches, which means, of course, it cannot fire at targets within that distance, and a maximum range that is up to 60 inches, which is quite a lot of reach for a light artillery piece. Just keep in mind that when you are playing bolt action, it is a game that you don't pre-measure in. You must declare if you are firing direct or indirect before measurement, and should you choose indirect fire and measure out only to see that your enemy is within 24 inches, it will count as a miss, and vice versa when measuring maximum range. But next up, we are going to see that the light howitzer is a single-shot weapon, much like the anti-tank guns, and this is something you're going to see across the board with the howitzer weapons. They are firing very large shells that are breech-loaded most of the time, and that simply just translates over to a lower firing speed and one shot in bolt action. And as we're all familiar with at this point, the hit modifier system in bolt action can be quite punishing, and it will make a lot of single-shot weapons feel very much like Hail Mary rolls for most of the game. However, like I mentioned earlier, having indirect fire does remedy that a bit, as it does allow you to zero in on your targets rather than just trying to make a crapshoot every time you fire. However, we are also going to see that high explosive weapons, when targeting buildings, do not target the unit inside the building, but rather the building itself, which means if your opponent wants to get cozy inside something like, say, a grain elevator, your howitzer is not going to be suffering hit penalties for trying to target enemies in heavy cover. Instead, they will very simply just measure to the building and see if it's within half range or not. And provided they are not down to their last man and have no pin markers on them, that will be the only hit modifier that they should be suffering. As described on page 125 of the 2nd edition rulebook, you are very clearly shooting at the walls of the building to hit the unit inside, which is also going to nullify the -1 to wound that they would usually have, alongside with ignoring their cover. Now, things do work a little bit differently when you are targeting units inside a building with indirect fire. Basically, you have to roll to see which floor the shell detonates on, which makes it a little bit harder to score a hit. So, whenever able, it is better to direct fire with howitzers against buildings. Meanwhile, if your opponent is in cover like a trench or, say, ruins, you are going to be better off lobbing shells with indirect fire. So, all that considered, just having one shot on the howitzer is not quite as punishing as it is on most other weapons in the game, but it is definitely a specific tool for a specific job, and if you're not playing into its battlefield role, you may have a bad time trying to hit your enemies. But next up, we are going to see that this weapon's penetration value is HE, meaning its penetration is going to be equal to its HE value, in this case, +2, and that is actually not going to drop off over long range as most other weapons would, as high explosive shells don't rely on velocity, but instead their explosive payload. And that means light howitzers are actually going to be quite potent at targeting soft skin and lightly armored vehicles. So if there's no juicy infantry targets in front of you, but a brave tankette is making its advance, there's a good chance you could take it off the table with this howitzer, even at longer ranges. Also, keep in mind, if you decide to fire on an enemy vehicle with indirect fire, when you do land a successful hit, it will count against their top armor, which will give you a +1 penetration bonus, upping your penetration value to 3, and if that vehicle is open-topped, it will give you yet another additional penetration value, upping it to 4, which is equivalent to that of a light anti-tank gun. Still, it is somewhat rare for you to score a hit with indirect fire on a vehicle, as they usually are on the move, and most of the time you are going to play it safe and go for the direct fire. That way, even if you don't get the better penetration value, you can at least put some pins on them. But while we're on the topic of engaging armor, I am going to point out that there is a good number of light artillery pieces in the game that can actually be upgraded with light anti-tank shells alongside their light howitzer profile. A good example of this is going to be the 25-pounder for the British, and this is actually a huge bargain buy that a lot of players seem to undervalue. Light howitzers and light anti-tank guns on their own aren't exactly the most imposing units, but they are very useful tools of the trade for certain jobs on the battlefield. Also, the howitzer and anti-tank profile are very frequently competing for the same slots in a reinforced platoon, so while the light howitzer may not be a squad-wiping one-shot weapon, and the light AT gun may not be a take-all-comers can opener, having a single unit that is under 60 points that can do both is wildly impressive. And while you may not use both of these weapon profiles in a single match, I guarantee you that you will make use of at least one of them, and the one you use may not initially be the one that you intended to bring. And like I said in my light anti-tank gun video, one light AT gun may not be the most imposing unit, but if you have several of them sprinkled throughout your list and they're on the field with overlapping arcs of fire, your enemy's vehicles are going to have a very hard time getting around and will likely be receiving a lot of pin markers even if they never actually get penetrated. Personally, one of my favorite combos when playing British is running a 25-pounder along with something like the Bishop SPG. So if you have the option to run a light howitzer with AT shells, I highly recommend you take it, as it really is the absolute best way to get that light AT profile into your list. But getting back to the stats at hand with the light howitzer profile, it is of course going to be a 2-inch high explosive weapon, which on the HE chart means you are going to be using the 2-inch high explosive template when deciding your targets, which when placing on an enemy unit can reliably cover 3 to 4 models, sometimes even 5 if they're bunched up super tight. And once again, it is going to have that +2 penetration, meaning on regular troops you are going to be wounding them on a roll of 2+, which needless to say is quite deadly. Meanwhile, against buildings, you are going to be doing d6 hits against the occupants inside them, meaning you roll to hit the building, and if you score a successful hit, you then roll a d6 and see how many of the models in that unit have been clipped, and then roll for that number in wounds. For example, if I fire at an enemy building at long range, I will suffer -1 to hit when targeting the building, but once I do hit it on that roll of 4+, then I roll a d6 to see how many models inside were clipped by the explosion hitting the building. But lastly, on the HE 2-inch profile, it is going to apply D3 pins when you hit an enemy unit with this, and this of course is replacing the standard single pin marker you would apply for a hit. It is not in addition to a pin marker. But the ability to put 3 pin markers on a single unit is quite devastating, especially if that unit just lost 3 to 4 models and is perhaps now down to half strength and must take a morale check. As we all know, once you get 3 pin markers on a unit, it is in a pretty bad spot when it comes to morale checks and receiving orders, and the light howitzer excels at making already damaged units run off the table if you get some lucky rolls with hits and pin markers. But the best thing about the high explosive profiles is that even if you come up short in one category, be it kills or pins, you are likely doing decent in the other. So if my light howitzer only manages to kill, say, 2 models in a unit, but that unit is then slapped with 3 pins, they're probably not going to have a very good time for the next few turns. However, you certainly will have those times where your howitzer shots not only land a bunch of kills, but also a high pin marker count, and I have personally seen this wombo combo make veteran squads run off the table immediately. So for just 50 points, sometimes 60, 65 points if you have things like spotter and AT shells, the light howitzer really only has to get one good hit in order to make its points back. In fact, from my experience, I would say that one good hit with a light howitzer has a pretty good chance of getting you double your points worth out of this unit. This weapon really has the ability to stop enemy troops dead in their tracks, be it by literally making them dead, or by simply pinning them out with those D3 pins. But what about the light howitzer when it's mounted on a vehicle? Well, this is where things get a little bit more tricky. As we've talked about in many of my previous videos, there is definitely a trade-off with armor where you are paying the points cost for your armor value, and then also the weapon attached to it. And there's a certain sweet spot in bolt action where you have a decent amount of armor matching a decent amount of firepower, which will make your unit defensible enough to last on the battlefield while dishing out enough damage to justify their points. However, with most of these weapons only being one shot, it really does put a cap on how much points you can sink into a vehicle unit before it becomes just simply more than it's worth and is capable of doing. And this sweet spot usually exists with medium tanks sporting medium-sized weapons, with some extra machine guns to make up for the low dice count on their primary ordnance. Unfortunately, when it comes to light howitzers, most of the time they do appear on medium tank chassis, and at that point you're paying a much larger premium for the chassis itself than the weapon, which makes it a very steep uphill battle for it to make its points back. And while the HE profile definitely makes it possible to do so, the squad wiping potential of something like a medium howitzer is definitely much more desirable. Still, there are a decent amount of light tanks sporting light howitzers in bolt action, and the British, once again getting referenced in this video, do have a bunch of early war vehicles that have the CS close support option, which tends to swap their light anti-tank guns for light howitzers, which on certain vehicles can be quite advantageous and quite economic. But at that point, you are putting a rather fragile budget vehicle into that coveted armor slot in your reinforced platoon, something that is usually saved for units that make up the backbone of your force. Now, there is definitely something to be said about going cheap in your armored slot in the reinforced platoon. It will allow you to invest in more and or better infantry units. And who's to say that you even need to worry about directing anti-armor to another slot in your list? I've run very successful lists where I outright ignore my enemy's armor and simply focus on things like large amounts of infantry and high explosive weapons, and simply play cat and mouse with their vehicles while I whittle away at their infantry. So if you are going to go for this strategy, running a light tank with a light howitzer and perhaps as many machine guns as you can fit onto the chassis will definitely prove to be a valuable investment. Still, you are going to need to finesse your deployments and also how you maneuver around the battlefield in order to engage your enemies selectively and not just come straight down the barrel of their big tanks, who could potentially wipe you out before you've made your points worth. So every now and then, I do find myself running a tank with a light howitzer, and if you can find something in the armored car slot of your reinforced platoon that has a light howitzer, I would say go ahead and give it a spin. Just don't use it like you would an armored car, and instead just treat it like an artillery piece on wheels and keep it back and shell your enemies from a distance, as most light howitzer armored cars are usually open-topped. And remember, open-top vehicles are easier to assault and also receive pins from small arms fire. But I did mention the Bishop SPG earlier, which is a weapon sporting that 25-pounder that's going to have both the high explosive 2-inch profile and also the light AT gun weapon profile. And while this unit isn't the best buy, I do think it's very utilitarian. And if your faction does have access to a vehicle with the elusive 25-pounder profile, sporting both light howitzer and light AT capabilities, I would say definitely add one to your collection and try running them alongside another light howitzer, as you can really saturate your opponent with high explosive fire without completely giving up your anti-armor capabilities. But that is going to wrap up our video on the light anti-tank gun. Overall, I think it's a fantastic unit that has no issue making its points back on the battlefield, and I find it to be a very underrated choice for the artillery slot in your reinforced platoon. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. What do you think about the light howitzer? How often do you use it? And how much do you love that 25-pounder profile? But as always, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead, leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications to see more of our bolt action unit guide. And as always, until next time, take care.